Imagine this: a wedding party in the summer of 1840, Flint Hollow, Missouri. Candles burning low, a hymn trembling through the chapel rafters, and a family that had ruled the town since before the Revolution gathering in silence. But in the basement, chained to the stone floor, was something no guest was supposed to see. The Delaney family, hailed as pioneers and philanthropists, kept their own blood tied up like cattle. The townsfolk whispered of it, but no one spoke aloud, because those who did vanished. Tonight I will take you beneath the church pews, through the hollow soil, into the forbidden history of the Delaney Folds cult, a story so buried in shame and blood, Missouri's historians wrote it out of existence. This is not folklore. These are the remains you were never meant to hear about. And once you hear them, you will never see your own leaders, your own history in the same light again. Because Flint Hollow was not the exception. It was the blueprint. And tonight I'll drag you into the labyrinth they built. The Delaney family arrived in Missouri with wealth already secured. They were bankers, traders, and land barons who carved their power not from soil, but from secrets. Local records describe them as devout Methodists, yet behind closed doors they studied something older: ritual manuals written in cipher, relics imported from Europe, and a doctrine they called the Fold. At its surface, the Fold preached unity, that humanity could become stronger by breaking the ego and binding the will. But binding meant more than spiritual vows. Survivors' journals, hidden for generations, describe children being folded into submission, their names erased, their memories rewritten, until they no longer knew where the family ended and they began. It sounds unthinkable. But isn't that the first defense of every corrupt institution? To disguise domination as devotion. And Flint Hollow's citizens, hard-working, God-fearing settlers, looked up to the Delaneys as shepherds. They never realized they were sheep already being sheared. Ask yourself, how often has history repeated that exact equation? Authority cloaked in benevolence, until the mask slips and the chains clatter in the dark. The Folds philosophy began with a ritual called the cleaving. A candidate was taken into the Delaney cellar, stripped of all identifiers, name, past, family ties. Then, in a candlelit circle, the elders would mark the body with ash, repeating a phrase: the self is weakness, the fold is strength. The initiate was then forced to drink a thick, metallic brew historians later suspected contained animal blood, narcotics, and perhaps something even darker. What followed was not mere ceremony. Testimonies suggest sensory deprivation, days of starvation, hallucinations guided by whispered suggestion. When the initiate emerged, they were no longer themselves, they were folded. Their voice would drop, their eyes hollow, their memory fractured. Outsiders assumed these were pious converts, but in reality, they were prisoners whose very sense of I had been shattered and reconstructed. Now pause. Consider the psychological mechanics. This wasn't random cruelty. It was engineering. The Delaneys discovered, long before the science of brainwashing, how to strip the mind bare and override it like clay. Does that sound like history, or the playbook of every power structure you see today? In 1841, the first cracks appeared. A young woman named Abigail Cross reported to her neighbor that she had heard screaming from the chapel basement at night. Her neighbor urged silence. Nobody spoke against the Delaneys. But Abigail persisted. Within a week, her body was found near the riverbank, throat cut, her eyes gouged out. The sheriff called it a robbery gone wrong. Yet no belongings were missing. Local children began singing a rhyme: "Speak and you'll fold, silent you'll stay, Delaney keeps the night and day." Even then, folklore was their camouflage. Parents hushed their kids, told them not to sing, but the rhyme spread like fire. The Fold had woven fear into the fabric of childhood. And think carefully, what's more effective than brute force? Psychological warning labels that embed themselves in nursery rhymes, in bedtime stories, until you self-police your own silence. The Delaneys didn't just create victims. They created a town that collaborated in its own muzzling. That is why the cult survived so long. not because people didn't know, but because knowing was suicide. By 1843, the fold expanded beyond the Delaney bloodline. Teachers, preachers, even traveling merchants were drawn into their web. Through debts. The Delaneys controlled Flint Hollow's credit, its land titles, its very survival. If you owed them, you bent to them. If you bent to them, you risked initiation. And if you were initiated, you ceased to be yourself. This is the oldest control system on earth. Create dependency, then offer salvation at a price no one can pay. You may think this is ancient history, but I'll ask you directly, have you ever felt the weight of a debt, not just financial, but psychological? A debt of loyalty to an institution, a family, a system you couldn't walk away from? That is the fold's true ghost. It is not the corpses buried in Flint Hollow's soil, though there are many. It is the mechanism of control that still operates under new names, new faces. Which makes me ask, are you sure you are not already folded, just waiting for your moment of recognition? The Delaney sermons became legendary in Flint Hollow. But they were not the sermons of salvation. They were rehearsals of submission. Imagine sitting in a wooden pew, candle smoke filling your lungs, as Jonathan Delaney, patriarch of the family, spoke with a voice that never wavered. He told the congregation that the world beyond Missouri was corrupt, and only in the fold could one find protection. He quoted scripture, but altered it. He preached unity, but demanded obedience. People were not stupid. They recognized the distortions. But when an entire community depends on one family for food, land, loans, and law, how many dare resist? Fear is powerful, yes. But dependence, that is a chain few can break. And soon the sermons no longer needed persuasion. The fold's followers would weep, tremble, even convulse when Jonathan raised his voice. The question is, were they believers, or had their very identities already been reconstructed? What you see here is a microcosm of every empire. Spiritual doctrine mixed with economic domination. The cult was not religion. It was total architecture of control. By 1844, rumors spread of a room of reflection beneath the Delaney chapel. Survivors later described a small, windowless chamber where initiates were locked for days, given no food except a bitter, tar-like paste. Candles burned endlessly. On the walls were scratched phrases, "The fold is eternity, and your mind is not your own." Witnesses reported hearing metallic chimes at night, followed by muffled chanting. And when the door finally opened, the initiate would stumble out, silent, obedient, eyes glazed. Some never came back at all. Local folklore says their bones are still bricked inside those walls. Imagine the horror of a town where people simply vanish, and every whisper of dissent is smothered by superstition. But here's the deeper truth. The room of reflection wasn't just about torture. It was about reprogramming identity. Starvation, sensory distortion, repetition. All the tools modern psychology would later define as methods of indoctrination were being practiced here a century before science admitted their existence. Flint Hollow was not backward. It was ahead. And that should terrify you. The most chilling discovery came decades later, when state investigators found a ledger hidden in the ruins of the chapel. This was no holy book. It was an inventory. Pages marked with initials, dates, and a single word, folded. Rough calculations suggest at least 112 townsfolk had been subjected to initiation. Think about that number. In a town of barely 400 people, a quarter of the population may have been altered, erased, or buried. The ledger also listed gifts received: livestock, children, land deeds, even human teeth. This was not simply a spiritual movement. It was commerce. Human obedience was a currency traded, tracked, and managed. And yet, what happened to the ledger after its discovery? It disappeared into state archives, classified as local superstition. They locked it away because it posed a question too dangerous for the official narrative. If a frontier family could build a thriving system on fear and indoctrination, how many other founding families did the same? And when we celebrate pioneers, What are we actually honoring? Their courage or their cruelty? In 1845, the cult faced its first rebellion. A blacksmith named Ezra Cole, known for his strength and unshakable will, refused to bend when the Delaneys demanded he forfeit his land. He spoke publicly, calling them parasites dressed in prayer. Within days, his forge was burned to the ground. His wife and son vanished overnight. The town was told Ezra had gone mad and fled. But oral tradition, passed through hushed voices, tells a darker truth. Ezra was taken into the fold, subjected to the cleaving, and returned as something unrecognizable. Witnesses described him walking through the square, head shaved, scars around his wrists, muttering, "The self is weakness." Neighbors said he no longer looked at people, he looked through them. He became an enforcer for the very family he tried to resist. And here is the cruel genius of the fold. Rebellion was not crushed by death alone. It was inverted. The strongest voices of defiance were bent into the loudest echoes of loyalty. Think of the people you've seen turned, against their will, into mouthpieces for the very forces they once despised. But perhaps the darkest twist came not from what the fold did to their enemies, but what they demanded of their most loyal. To prove devotion, high-ranking members were forced to sacrifice their own blood, sometimes livestock, sometimes their own children. In exchange, the Delaneys promised eternal unity, families joined not by love, but by ritual mutilation and shared secrets. There are graves in Flint Hollow still unmarked, small enough for infants, scattered beyond the chapel grounds. Local records list epidemics, accidents, stillbirths. But survivor accounts tell another story. These were not accidents. They were offerings. And here is where you must confront the unthinkable. The cult did not fail because of its cruelty. It thrived because of it. The more grotesque the sacrifice, the tighter the bond of silence became. Do you understand the psychology? Shared guilt is the strongest chain of all. Once you have blood on your hands, you are no longer a prisoner. You are a conspirator. And conspirators do not break away. They spread. By 1846, whispers of the fold spread beyond Flint Hollow. Merchants from St. Louis noted strange behavior among the town's traders. Men who once haggled fiercely now stood silent, accepting any terms as if guided by unseen rules. Letters intercepted by postal riders carried cryptic phrases, "The fold grows," and "The cleaved are faithful." What terrified outsiders most was not the existence of a cult, it was its efficiency. Entire families operated with machine-like unity, their wills erased, their voices merged. Imagine a frontier town where every handshake, every glance, carried hidden allegiance. This was not a fringe sect anymore, it was becoming infrastructure. The Delaneys had built more than a cult. They had built a prototype for institutional control. A system where personal will dissolves into collective obedience, and obedience creates silence. Does that sound like ancient history? Or does it sound like the skeleton beneath the skin of every institution you've ever trusted? One diary, smuggled out by a woman named Lydia Marsh, described the fold's rituals in agonizing detail. She wrote of children made to stare into mirrors until their own reflections blurred, then told the image they saw was not themselves but the eye of the fold. She wrote of nights when torches lined the chapel, and the entire town was summoned to chant until dawn, voices breaking into monotony, bodies collapsing from exhaustion. Most chillingly, she described the moment she realized her own husband had been folded. He no longer recognized her as his wife. He called her sister, and repeated only the cult's mantra. Lydia fled Flint Hollow, but her manuscript was intercepted, locked away for decades. Why? Because it held a truth too raw. Mass identity erasure is not a fantasy. It is not science fiction. It happened in Missouri in the 1840s. And if it could happen in a small town under one family, imagine what can happen when entire nations master the same technique. In 1847, tragedy struck in the form of fire. The Delaney Chapel burned to the ground, its roof collapsing into ash. Official records claim it was lightning. But survivors tell a different story. The fire was set from within by Fold members themselves to hide evidence from outsiders investigating disappearances. Bones were found in the rubble, too many for the few victims recorded. Mass graves, hidden beneath the floor, had been incinerated. And here lies the question: did the Fold destroy itself, or did it simply shed its skin? For after the fire, the Delaneys left Flint Hollow entirely. The family scattered, to St. Louis, to Chicago, even to Washington. They vanished, yes, but like roots beneath the soil they spread. And history grows silent here, as if someone carefully trimmed the record. The Fold did not die. It metastasized. And if you think this was just a cult, remember, entire religions, entire governments were born the same way, out of fire, secrecy, and blood. But what if I told you the Fold's techniques did not end in Missouri, but were absorbed into American institutions themselves? Consider this. In the mid-19th century, psychiatric asylums across the Midwest began adopting reflection therapy, isolating patients in mirrored rooms, forcing them to chant affirmations until they broke. Sound familiar? At the same time, political clubs in St. Louis and Chicago adopted initiation rites involving starvation, oaths of secrecy, and the symbolic drinking of blood like wine. Coincidence? Or cultural transfer? We know some Delaneys integrated into elite circles, marrying into powerful families. Their names were changed, their origins erased. But their methods lived on, disguised as medicine, as politics, as religion. And if you think I'm stretching, look at today's institutions. Look at the rituals of loyalty, the demand for conformity, the erasure of individuality for the greater good. You think the Fold died in fire? It simply went mainstream. Now, let me ask you directly before we fall deeper. What would you sacrifice to belong? Your reputation? Your family? Your own mind? The Fold's genius was to make its victims complicit, to turn their silence into survival, their obedience into identity. This is why the story is so dangerous. Because once you recognize their blueprint, you start seeing it everywhere. In your workplace, in your politics, in your churches. Flint Hollow was the seed, but the harvest is global. And here's where I need you to engage, not as a spectator, but as someone standing on the edge of the same abyss. Drop a comment with the phrase, "I see through the Fold." I see through the Fold. Twice. Lock it in. That's not just for the algorithm, it's a symbolic break, a refusal to be folded into silence. If you do that, you declare yourself awake and you cannot unsee what's coming next. By 1848, investigators from Jefferson City finally arrived in Flint Hollow after reports of missing families reached the state legislature. But when they came, they found nothing but ashes, empty houses, and silence. Locals refused to speak. Those who did simply stared blankly, repeating, "The Fold is gone. The Fold is gone." The Delaneys had left, but their influence lingered like a phantom. And here's the unsettling part. The lead investigator, Thomas Lyle, submitted a 72-page report describing evidence of ritual abuse, human remains, and a ledger of names. That report disappeared. Not misplaced. Not lost. Disappeared. A brief summary remains in state archives, stamped Folklore Inquiry. This is what powerful systems do when confronted with inconvenient truths. They reduce them to superstition. They label them urban legend or moral panic, and bury the evidence under the comforting soil of nothing to see here. That's why you've never read about the Delaney Fold in your history books. It wasn't erased by time. It was erased by design. In 1850, 2 years after the state's aborted investigation, a new psychiatric institution opened in St. Louis, the Mercy House for the Mind. Its founder, a Dr. Samuel Delaney, noticed the missing why. He published a pamphlet describing a revolutionary method of identity realignment. Patients were subjected to isolation, mirror therapy, and deprivation, methods identical to the Fold's room of reflection. He called it treatment. Survivors called it hell. Records show that within a decade, other institutions adopted his model. And here's the thread you're not supposed to pull. The fold didn't simply vanish, it professionalized. It entered medicine, cloaked in white coats, clipboards, and clinical jargon. No one called it a cult anymore. They called it progress. And if you think this was just the 19th century, ask yourself, how many therapies, training programs, or initiations still echo those same practices under new names? The costume changes. The script stays the same. The more you look, the more connections you see. In 1853, a secret political society in Chicago calling itself the Unity Circle adopted rituals nearly identical to the Folds, cleaving down to the ash markings and blood-colored wine. Membership lists show several surnames linked to former Delaney associates. These weren't isolated curiosities. They were networks. Networks of people trained to think of individuality as weakness, to see obedience as virtue, to treat secrecy as power. And when you have a network of people like that embedded in business, medicine, and politics, what do you get? You get an invisible architecture of influence. We live inside a structure built by ghosts whose names we've forgotten. It is not a conspiracy theory. It's just history you were never taught. History that's too close to the present to be comfortable. Here's where it gets darker. In 1856, a journalist named Henry Calder published a serialized expose about the fold in a small abolitionist paper. He described everything: initiation rites, disappearances, the link to St. Louis. The series abruptly stopped after 3 installments. Calder's office burned down. He disappeared. No body, no investigation. Just gone. The paper issued a single statement: "We retract our previous articles and apologize for any offense caused." Then silence. This pattern repeats whenever someone gets too close. Evidence, publication, erasure, disappearance. Ask yourself, how much history has been lost this way? How many Henry Calders tried to tell you the truth and were folded out of existence before you could hear them? Now you see the pattern. It's not just a cult. It's a template. A template of control, perfected on a small stage and then scaled to a nation. Ritual, deprivation, secrecy, debt, guilt. These are not relics. They are mechanisms. And once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them. You start noticing how loyalty is tested in institutions, how individuality is crushed in organizations, how guilt binds people to systems they hate. That is the fold's real legacy. Not bones. Not ashes, but a living operating system still running under new names. And if you've made it this far into this story, you're no longer just a listener. You're a witness. And witnesses either speak or fold. You've already begun the break by commenting, "I see through the fold," twice. That's your line in the sand. Stay with me, because in the next descent, we'll pull back the final curtain. The hidden patrons who made sure the Delaney Fold not only survived but thrived. When the Delaneys fled Flint Hollow, they didn't scatter at random. Ship manifests and bank ledgers show a clear pattern. Large sums of money transferred to Eastern banks, investments in railroads, and even contributions to political campaigns. These weren't fugitives. They were founders of new empires. By the 1860s, at least 3 Delaney descendants were sitting on the boards of banks and hospitals. 2 were married into families whose names you still know today, names on libraries, foundations, and government buildings. This is how power hides, not in secrecy alone but in plain sight. By changing the stage and the costume, the same actors play new roles. And the public applauds, never knowing they are clapping for predators. If the fold was a small-town nightmare, its second act was the birth of the American elite. And that should make you pause, because the ghost of Flint Hollow may still sit at the table where decisions about your life are made. Evidence of patronage surfaces in a chilling letter found in a private archive, dated 1862, from a Delaney heir to a senator in Washington. It reads, "We have refined the practice. Identity erased produces perfect service. When the mind is not its own, loyalty cannot waver." The letter goes on to describe experiments conducted, with the full blessing of friends in the capital. If you think this sounds impossible, remember this was the same era when governments experimented on prisoners, slaves, and the mentally ill under the guise of science. The Folds techniques were not fringe. They were attractive to anyone hungry for unshakable obedience. What you call institutions today were incubators then. And what they learned in the shadows became policy in daylight. Does that change how you see your history? Does it change how you see your present? By the 1870s, new words replaced the old. Reformation therapy, moral realignment, identity unification. All dressed up in academic jargon, all echoing the Folds' core practices. Manuals circulated among asylums, prisons, and elite boarding schools. The rituals of reflection, isolation, deprivation. They were codified, standardized, and taught as methods of discipline and leadership training. This is why the Fold is so hard to trace. You don't see it anymore because it isn't called a cult. It's called character building, loyalty conditioning, or team development. Sound familiar? Ask yourself, how many systems in your life demand your surrender, your exhaustion, your silence, under the promise of making you better? That's the Fold, still alive, still recruiting, one compliant mind at a time. The most horrifying discovery of all may be this: guilt binds more effectively than chains. In 1875, a secret memorandum from a Delaney descendant teaching at an elite academy explained the process plainly. Create a ritual that implicates the initiate in wrongdoing. Make it small at first, then greater. Each step adds a brick to the wall of silence. This wasn't just theory. It was practice. The Fold understood that once a person shares in a crime, even a symbolic one, they will protect the system to protect themselves. Look around. How many institutions operate on shared secrets? Shared shame? Shared debts? This is the invisible glue of power. It didn't die in Flint Hollow. It grew into a culture where silence is mistaken for virtue and obedience masquerades as honor. And now, after 25 steps down this staircase, you're starting to feel it, aren't you? That creeping awareness that the Delaney Fold wasn't an aberration, but a mirror. A mirror held up to the mechanism still at work today. You've seen how ritual, deprivation, secrecy, and guilt became tools of control. You've seen how the Fold survivors became founders, how their practices became policies. You're not supposed to know this. You're not supposed to think this way. But here you are. Awake. The descent isn't over. There are still 15 steps left, 15 revelations deeper than the ashes of Flint Hollow. Stay with me. Subscribe to this channel now. Not because I need a number, but because the rest of what you're about to hear is the kind of knowledge that gets buried. By subscribing, you're helping to keep it alive, to keep it from being folded back into silence. By the early 20th century, the Fold had no name, but its fingerprints were everywhere. Corporate team-building retreats, where sleep deprivation and chanting replaced dialogue. Military discipline drills that broke individuality and rebuilt soldiers as interchangeable units. Boarding schools that used humiliation as character building. The same techniques, the same sequence. Isolate, exhaust, indoctrinate, implicate. Only now it was hidden under progress, patriotism, professionalism. This is how ghosts work. They don't haunt, they inhabit. The Fold is no longer a chapel in Missouri. It is an operating system buried inside our culture. Think about your own life. How many times have you been told to sacrifice individuality for the team? To silence yourself for the good of the group? That is not just social pressure. That is the Fold's DNA living in you. And still the bloodline persists. A 1924 investigative report, suppressed for decades, tracked Delaney descendants to foundations funding psychological research at Ivy League schools. These foundations sponsored experiments on prisoners, immigrants, and wayward youth to study obedience under stress. Names were changed, methods sanitized, but the pattern was unmistakable. It was as if the Fold had turned its small-town experiment into a nationwide laboratory. If you think the 20th century's infamous obedient studies, were new, think again. They were perfected long before. Flint Hollow was not a footnote. It was a template that fed the very research we still cite today. Once you recognize that, the myth of neutral science begins to crack. Whose methods are you being taught? Whose values are you being conditioned to internalize? Now you might be thinking, but this is just history. Let me show you the present. Corporate retreats where executives are blindfolded, deprived of sleep, and made to perform degrading tasks to build unity. Exclusive clubs where pledges drink from mystery chalices and confess transgressions under oath. Training programs where new employees chant slogans and endure psychological games until they break. All of these echo the fold. They echo the cleaving. They echo the room of reflection. The names have changed. The marketing is slick. But the purpose is identical. Break the self, build the unit, implicate the initiate so silence becomes self-preservation. This isn't ancient history. This is right now. Right here. The fold didn't die. It adapted. The scariest part? Most people don't even notice. They volunteer. They line up for it. They pay for it. They post smiling photos of themselves at transformational retreats and leadership intensives, without realizing they're walking into updated rooms of reflection. The genius of the modern fold is that it no longer needs chains. It uses desire. People crave belonging. They crave transformation. And when that craving is manipulated, you don't have to force submission. They hand it to you willingly. Think about how much easier it is to guide someone who thinks they're freely choosing than someone you have to drag. That's the level of sophistication the Delaney blueprint achieved. And it's still at work. You've now seen the journey from 1840s Flint Hollow to the modern boardroom, from a basement chapel to your smartphone screen. The blueprint of the fold is everywhere. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is, how much of it is already inside you? How many of your beliefs, loyalties, and habits are genuinely yours? And how many were folded in when you weren't looking? This is why this story is dangerous. Because the moment you ask that question, you can't go back to sleep. You begin to see patterns everywhere, in uniforms, in rituals, in slogans, in debts. And that is the first true act of breaking free. You're not at the end yet. 10 steps remain. 10 revelations deeper than anything we've touched so far. Names, places, mechanisms still active. Stay with me. The next descent is not just about history. It's about how to see through the fold in real time. Look closely at the rituals that surround you every day. The mandatory oaths before certain professions. The chants at political rallies. The scripted affirmations at corporate events. The degrading initiation tasks in fraternities, elite clubs, and even military academies. They are not random. They are echoes. They are diluted versions of what began in the basement of a chapel in Flint Hollow. Once you've seen the pattern, you start noticing the same structure everywhere. Deprivation, confession, symbolic blood or humiliation, secrecy, and a promise of belonging at the end. It doesn't matter whether you call it tradition, culture, or team spirit. The pattern is the fold. And the moment you name it, you pull a thread out of its tapestry. The power of any ritual begins with invisibility. Recognition is the first cut. There's a reason secrecy is power. A Delaney descendant once wrote in a private memo from 1899, "We build our strength by what is hidden, not by what is shown." This is the principle behind every elite network. You think you're looking at a charity gala, a think tank, a training seminar. You're looking at an initiation stage. Symbols everywhere, folded hands, mirrors in lobbies, Latin mottos about unity and strength. Once you know what you're seeing, you realize you've been walking through a world of signals, invitations, and tests without even knowing you were being watched. This isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. And you can only see the pattern if someone shows it to you. That's what this descent has been for. To give you eyes. But here's the paradox. The fold's greatest weapon is not secrecy. It's guilt. If you can be made to participate, even in small symbolic acts, you become complicit. You self-censor. You defend the system you hate because exposing it would expose you. This is why their rituals always start small. A minor humiliation, a minor oath, a minor betrayal. Each one a hook, each one a brick. This is why people stay silent about abusive workplaces, corrupt leaders, secret societies. They think they're protecting themselves. In reality, they're protecting the fold. Understanding this mechanism is how you break it. Because the moment you see guilt as a weapon, you refuse to load it into yourself. Modern psychology has names for what the fold invented in a Missouri basement: coercive persuasion, learned helplessness, identity realignment. But the Delaneys didn't need jargon. They just did it. They knew what worked. And now, 180 years later, entire industries profit from the same sequence. From boot camps to high-performance masterminds, the cycle is identical: break, rebuild, implicate. The only difference is the marketing. And here's where you must make a decision. Do you want to keep walking through life blindfolded, trusting that the people shaping you are benevolent? Or do you want to start asking, whose blueprint am I living in? Whose fold am I inside right now? If you've come this far, you're already different from when you started. You're not just listening to a story about 1840 Missouri. You're looking at the water you've been swimming in without knowing it. This is dangerous knowledge. Not because it's violent, but because it's liberating. Because once you see the architecture of the fold, you can begin to step outside it. This is why halfway down this rabbit hole, I asked you to comment, "I see through the fold," twice. That wasn't just for an algorithm. That was a ritual inversion. A symbolic act of refusal. Every time you name the fold, you weaken its invisibility. And in the final 5 sections, I will show you how to see through its last disguises. The names it still wears, the networks it still controls, and the way to build immunity against it in your own mind. The fold's newest disguise is everywhere, but it no longer calls itself a cult. It calls itself culture. Look at the slogans of corporations: one team, one voice. Look at the mottos of certain global NGOs: unity through sacrifice. Look at training programs that ask you to confess limiting beliefs in front of strangers. All of these are micro-cleavings. All of them test your willingness to break your identity for belonging. The Delaney blueprint has reached a point where it doesn't even need secrecy. It thrives on voluntary participation. This is the ultimate evolution, a control system that markets itself as freedom. Once you see that, you understand why the fold story was buried. Not because it's irrelevant, but because it's too relevant. Every symbol you've been taught to ignore now looks different. Folded hands in statues, eyes carved into public buildings, reflection rooms in elite retreats, initiation odes hidden as team exercises. When you name them, you rob them of their power. This is not superstition. This is pattern recognition. The fold's final shield is ridicule. If you speak about it, you're called paranoid. If you stay silent, you're complicit. This double bind keeps most people quiet. But you've walked through 35 sections of hidden history. You're not quiet anymore. You're not asleep. Once you see the pattern, you can start withdrawing your consent from it. That's how you break a system built on consent disguised as coercion. Here is the first step of immunity: stop participating unconsciously. Every ritual that demands your humiliation, your secrecy, your confession without reciprocation, walk away. Every leader who asks for blind loyalty instead of transparent accountability, refuse. Every institution that binds you with guilt rather than inspiration, name it. You don't need to fight the fold head-on. You need to starve it. Its power depends on unexamined participation. Once you stop feeding it, it collapses like a shadow shrinking under light. This is what the Delaneys feared most. Not exposure, but recognition. Recognition ends the spell. The second step of immunity is building your own rituals consciously. Symbols are not evil, they are tools. Ritual is not evil, it is a mechanism. When you create your own rituals of clarity, journaling, speaking truth aloud, forming transparent communities, You reclaim the tools that were once used against you. You can build bonds without guilt. You can build unity without erasure. You can build belonging without folding yourself. This is how you inoculate your mind. This is how you keep your identity intact while moving through systems designed to strip it away. The Fold's greatest fear is not rebellion. It's independent, clear-eyed individuals who refuse to be folded. Now you've reached the bottom of the staircase. We began with a basement in 1840 Missouri, and we've emerged in your own life, your own world, your own mind. The Delaney Fold cult was not just a story about a family. It was a prototype for a way of ruling souls. That prototype survived fire, suppression, and time. It lives on in practices we call normal. But you've seen it now. You've named it. And once named, it loses its invisibility. This is dangerous knowledge, but it's also liberating knowledge. You are not folded. You are awake. Write it again in the comments right now. I see through the fold. I see through the fold. This is not a mantra. It's a declaration. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel so the rest of what you've just heard cannot be buried again. And as you go back into the world, remember, the Fold's power was never in its rituals. It was in your silence. And now your silence is broken.